Hello, I want to talk to you about all the various mysteries around the Osireion. And obviously, the biggest one is the building, the Osireion itself. But there are other really mysterious things like the Tomb of Osiris or the Flower of Life. So I've compiled things that I think are the top things about the mysteries of the Osireion, and here they are. Oh, and I am doing a separate one on all the building techniques, all the mysteries around that as well. So this one is the just the ordinary mysteries. Ordinary mysteries. Go figure. The Osireion is a megalithic marvel standing unassumingly at the rear of the Seti First Temple in Abydos, Egypt. Its origin, according to archaeologists, coincides with the construction of that temple, and that would make it about 3,300 years ago. The architectural style, however, is more in line with the buildings of the Old Kingdom, dating back 4,500 years. Yet I propose that it actually predates even the Old Kingdom. What we see of this building is but the tip of a 5-story megalithic stone iceberg. So it goes down about 15 meters. Let's also add to that the fact that it's built on sand and not on a base of bedrock. It's actually apparently to honour the god Osiris, whose body, or at least most of it, has some secret tomb somewhere. But it is assumed that this is just symbolic. I will explain more. So there is a large room at the end of the Osireion that has no original entrance and was essentially sealed. The best explanation for this room is from ancient architects, so I'll play you their clip.
By breaking through the middle cell on the eastern wall of the central hall, you enter what is known as the sarcophagus room. This crude entrance is the only way in or out, apart from one treasure hunter's tunnel in the northern end of the eastern wall. What is most interesting about this chamber is that scholars believe that the room itself is one enormous sarcophagus. There is no original entrance, and it is therefore safe to assume that it was never meant to have one.
Some refer to this room as the sarcophagus of Osiris, while others call it the blind chamber or the sealed chamber. This room is a mystery to archaeologists, as well as to the rest of us. Lying behind the eastern wall of the Great Hall is another transverse hall. It is exactly the same as the one on the western side, except that this hall had no connection originally with the rest of the building. Its present entrance is through a hole in the back wall of the central square cell of the eastern wall of the hall, and this hole was forced through in modern times. Yet during the reign of Seti I, this transverse hall must have been accessible, as he had decorated its saddle roof with a wonderful scene of the sky goddess Nut stretched out over the world. About 20 years ago from the time of the writing of this, the western part of the temple of Seti I was in danger of collapsing, so 14 great piers of steel and concrete were sunk into the ground to below water level between the western wall and the temple and the eastern wall of the transverse hall. But during this operation, no connecting passage or stairway linking the two buildings was discovered. So we still do not know how Seti's men got in to decorate the roof. Seti was working on the assumption that Seti I actually found the Osireion rather than built it, hence the question about how his people got into the sealed room to decorate it. Of course, archaeologists since then have decided that the whole place was in fact constructed by Seti I. I obviously don't agree with that. So let's just clarify exactly where it is. So from this diagram, if we're coming in from the right side, where you can see the black line coming down, entering into the Osireion, and then the Osireion, which is surrounded by the green water, and then passing through into another black area, which is the room that is the sealed room or sarcophagus of Osiris. And on this diagram from James Westerman, you can see on the right-hand side the room looking a bit like an extra long barn in this diagram. So if it isn't obvious from this diagram, go to the very back, and in one of the little niche rooms, there is the back of the wall of that little tiny room has been smashed open, and you can go from there into this gigantic room, which is considered to be the sarcophagus of Osiris, or the symbolic sarcophagus. And it has no other way of access, except up in one corner there is like this weird little hole, which they say has been dug by robbers who were trying to get access to underneath the Seti temple, but doesn't seem to go anywhere, so they didn't have any success with that. As I said, this chamber is pretty big, so it's 20 meters by 5 meters, and it's got a rather unusual vaulted roof. And I mean unusual because it's not as if the blocks are shaped to go upwards. It's actually square blocks carved to look like they go upwards. It's quite clever, really. It is because of this room that archaeologists reached the conclusion that the whole building was something to do with Osiris, and that room was the tomb of Osiris. And this conclusion was made based on the reliefs that are inside this room, and they are of some kind of ritual. They are part of the book of the lower world, and they're a ritual scene which are typical for some of the tombs of ancient Egyptian rulers. And here is a quote from Edouard Naville. "This room, perfectly preserved, is absolutely empty except for a heap of sand in the northeastern corner. When this sand was cleared away, we found that it came from a hole dug there, evidently by robbers, as is in the case of many tombs in Egypt." Edouard Naville also pointed out the parallels between this room and the pyramid of Khafre, as you can see in the diagrams. So where does all this leave us? We have a sealed room at the back of the Osireion and seemingly no way to access it. Well, my theory is this, that there was a way to access it, and I've seen it in several other places where a very large block is able to be slid to open up an area, but the area that you walk through is a small area once the block has been removed. And here are a few examples of places where I think that has actually occurred. So this picture is from the Red Pyramid, and this picture is from the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khufu. And this last picture is from a site called Qasr el Sagar, which is an Old Kingdom, theoretically an Old Kingdom site, and it also has that same small block that can be removed, providing entry to a room which is effectively completely sealed if it weren't for this block that was able to be removed. Based on all that, I believe that Seti I found the Osireion, worked out how to break into the sealed chamber, along the way found a lot of interesting things, including information and objects, and decorated the area in order to claim it as his own and do the honouring of the gods. It is also interesting to note that he later sealed it up, so he didn't really want anybody else getting in there. Yet another interesting aspect of the Osireion is the flower of life. The design is located within the Osireion on two of the granite columns. There are 5 of these flowers of life on each of these 2 columns, and they are essentially 19 overlapping circles drawn on top of each other. They are really just graffiti drawn on the pillar, probably from about the time when the Osireion was full of sand, and they are drawn in red ochre, and it looks like they're etched in some kind of way, but that just might be my eyesight, I don't know. But they are very faint and difficult to see. When the Egyptologist was pointing them out to me and the others I was with in the tour, it was like I could barely see it until I really focused. And then this strange pattern emerged. It kind of reminded me of one of those magic seeing eye pictures. But yeah, maybe that's just my weird eyesight. But they're dated by some archaeologists to the early Christian era, although it could be earlier or later, we don't know. And they're certainly not from the same time as the Osireion. And it's not an easy task to create a flower of life. They are quite a geometric challenge. And it's one of those things that is considered sacred geometry. So it's a sacred geometry pattern. And this is just a 2-dimensional representation of this pattern. But the pattern also works in 3 dimension. So what does this pattern mean? What does this symbol mean? Well, it kind of means a lot of different things to different people. But to some, it represents the creation of life. To others, it's the joining of the sacred masculine with the divine feminine in terms of energies. And it's considered also to represent the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. There seem to be a lot of other meanings to it as well. It's got quite a lot of meaning to it, but those seem to be the main ones. Another concept I found was that the flower of life is a key for hidden knowledge. And finally, a representation of the inner connectivity of all living things. So mathematicians will tell you that inside the structure there are many mathematical forms, and those include the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, and Megatron's cube. The flower of life, from my perspective, is a design that represents the secrets of life, or longevity. So what meaning was intended by the people who put the design onto the walls of those massive pillars? Well, my opinion on this is that they did actually know something about the Osireion, and it's kind of like labeling it. It's like saying, this is a place for healing, for life. And maybe it was knowledge passed down, maybe they had read something somewhere, but it certainly seems to represent the Osireion and the times of Zep-Tepi. I believe that the ancient Egyptians were constantly searching for artifacts from a much earlier epoch, and some of those artifacts were just beautiful items like stone vases, which may or may not have contained stuff that might have been of interest to the ancient Egyptians. Things like a cream that could fix a wound, that sort of thing. And some were more technological in nature, providing abilities to do things that the ancient Egyptians previously couldn't do. I'm thinking of things like the Shamir of Solomon or the Ark of the Covenant, maybe something that gave the ability for levitation, or maybe just information, interesting information, like things that were around during the time of Zep-Tepi, or lists of previous leaders. I know this sounds a little bit crazy, but bear with me. After Seti I came Ramses the Great. Now this is important, but let's just stop at this point and look back at the history of this family. Ramses the Great was born in 1303 BC, and he was about 11 when his grandfather, Ramses I, was made Pharaoh of Egypt, and thus began the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom, because they weren't of royal blood. Anyway, Ramses I had a very brief reign, and his son Seti I took over as Pharaoh. Now this is the Seti I that we've been talking about regarding the Osireion. Anyway, he reigned for about 11 years before he died, and the crown was passed to Ramses II, who was obviously the son of Seti I. And that happened in about 1279 BC, when Ramses was about 24. For the early part of the reign of Ramses II, he focused on building a brand new city, and he was doing lots of building projects, multiple temples, and some very significant statues and gigantic monuments. I mean, seriously major, massive building projects and statues. They were just of momentous size, and lots of them. This guy was prolific. Then, once he's got his building projects underway, he starts to get stuck into some unpleasant military expeditions, like into Canaan and Phoenicia, Nubia, etc. There's good reason that I brought up the subject of the Canaanites. Not just because I feel so terribly sorry for the Canaanites. Not only did they have the Egyptians who had it in for them, but they were also persecuted by the God of the Israelites, who ordered his people to commit genocide on a grand scale. And those poor Canaanites, they were supposed to be essentially murdered, every single one of them, man, woman and child, except for some exceptions, but that is even just as unpleasant as the genocide. So I'm not going to go there, but this is important because the Canaanites were part of the areas, the peoples that Ramses went after. So Ramses the Great is supposed to be the Pharaoh of the Bible, the one that chased the Israelites. But this story doesn't hold any water for me, so I will make that a separate episode discussing that. I think we're looking at a different Pharaoh altogether. But anyway, let's keep going talking about Ramses. He lived an amazingly long life, dying at about the age of 91 and having celebrated an unprecedented 13 or maybe 14 Sed festivals, more than any other pharaoh. A Sed festival is held after 30 years on the throne, and it's held every 3 years just to prove that the pharaoh is still fit to rule the country. Can't help but think we probably need to reinstate that. That's such a good idea. Anyway, so we're looking at a possible reign length of over 66 years, and this certainly gave him plenty of time to ensure that he left a significant legacy. But even so, the legacy he left was, well, let's say it was larger than life. And how did he do that? Well, some of his legacy wasn't actually his. He had an interesting habit of taking something a previous ruler had done and then stamping his name all over it. Often he would stamp it in a very deep manner so that no one else could ever claim the structures in the same way that he had done. It was fascinating to see examples of this both in Luxor and at Tanis. The depth was amazing. But he came straight after his father Seti and achieved all these amazing things. And his father Seti had started to do some pretty amazing things himself, like the massive temple of Abu Simbel with its gigantic statues. This was actually started off by his father, Seti the First, and of course Ramses the Great. He finished it off and put his name on it. But the fact that these massive projects got underway at this point in time indicates to me that Seti the First actually found something interesting in the Osireion. I know it's a massive jump, but there seems to be a lot going on immediately after Seti the First finds the Osireion. I'm not just talking about his beautiful building projects. There is something very interesting about his new city, Pi Ramses. When it was set up, it included a large number of factories. Yes, you heard me right, factories. So these factories were to make weapons, chariots, items of warfare, and in this he was also prolific. As you might expect with all these weapons, there was also many military campaigns. Ramses II is depicted in this picture charging into battle against tribes of the south of Egypt with his two young sons, Amun-Kukepshep and Khayyam Waset. And yes, this is the same Khayyam Waset that I did all those episodes on some time ago. So if you haven't seen those episodes, they're all about this amazing guy. His body was never found. This is particularly intriguing because in his tomb was a mummy made up of old bull bones, wrapped up like a mummy, made to look like a human body. Oh, and if that's not enough, he's also the very first recognized Egyptologist, and that's because he was digging in old sites, he was doing restorations, he was finding artifacts, and according to the mythology, he was finding some other very interesting things that one could only describe as either magic or high technology. I realize that by now you're probably wondering, what has all this got to do with the Osireion? So, trust me, it does. It really does. So, Ramses II hung out with his dad a lot, Seti the First, and learnt a lot from him. And, of course, he would have spent time in the Osireion with his father. And the person that followed in his footsteps was Merenptah. Merenptah was his son, but more importantly, he was very determined to get back into the Osireion. But Seti I had blocked it up. Obviously, Seti I didn't want anybody else getting in there. But Merenptah managed to get in there. He managed to go through a different way, and obviously he then got on with things for himself. So my question is, what was it that Seti I found in the Osireion? Why did he block it up? And why was Merenptah so determined to get back into the Osireion? We do know that Egypt had some serious tech, and we know this from the Bible because of the things that are described regarding the Ark of the Covenant, the Shamir of Solomon, and various other things. Even though the Shamir of Solomon is supposed to have been provided by a demon. I think that it also came from Egypt and was found in the ruins of the ancients. And if the Israelites had already stolen a heap of their tech, of course they were always on the lookout for more tech. Certainly looks that way with regards to Seti the First, with Ramses and Merempetah. Now it gets really good. But let's start with a clip from Funny Old World, because Johanna has a great way of describing this.
Previously, when they've LiDAR scanned the entire site, that's when they found out that the side moat goes down 15 meters, and there is things on the LiDAR scan that could imply that this is in fact hollow. Perhaps there is chambers and lower floors to this, because the whole thing's about 5 stories deep.
Yes, you heard it right. So they've done scans on the Osireion going deep into the ground, and they found cavities. So that means that this building, which is made of solid blocks, may not be completely solid blocks. And there is a theory that the part that goes down 5 stories has a chamber which is similar in design to that of the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid. So the gallery has a ceiling which consists of corbel vaulted blocks. So that is how it is able to withstand the great weight of having all those massive blocks of stone on top of it, and how it can have such a cavity. So if there is a hollow chamber inside the Osireion, this is possibly the way that they have coped with having all this massive volume of stone, which would weigh an enormous amount, on top of this hollow cavity, without it obviously collapsing. The question on everyone's lips, especially the archaeologists, is what's inside that cavity? Could it be a treasure like that of the tomb of Tutankhamun? Or is it the body of Osiris, possibly? Or is it something else? In my opinion, it will be empty, except for maybe some water. There are stories of a canal that runs between the Osireion and the Nile. And this canal is supposed to be deep, deep underground, going under the great temple of Seti I. And it sounds quite mysterious. There is a very interesting paper by a gentleman called Wayne J. Howson, and it's called Osireion, One Night's Thoughts, 4 Years' Work, or something along those lines. And in it, he goes to great lengths looking at the possibility of a canal. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of what he talks about, but it's quite compelling, especially the evidence that they found of granite precisely where it is supposed to be at the entrance to the temple, and fairly deep underground at that. Seti even spoke of this canal, and Strabo also mentioned this canal, having seen it. So the archaeologists seem to be taking it reasonably seriously, and work has gone on to try and find it, but so far nothing as far as we know. Just from looking at these pictures of the Osireion and the green slimy looking water there, you'd think to yourself, that is pretty revolting water, and yet it's healing water. And I know I wouldn't like to drink the stuff, but tests have been done, and the water certainly does have some unique properties. But I think I will let one of the other alternative researchers explain this, because I think Johanna does a much better job of explaining these properties, and then we'll come back and I'll discuss it from my perspective. So here is a short clip from Funny Old World.
Stretching back into antiquity, the water here has been legendary for its healing properties. The water there is scientifically tested, and it is different because the water in the Osireion is incredibly unique, and the ancients knew that. How they knew that, not sure, but they knew that. With the water potentially being activated to create a biochemical transformation.
She later goes on in this episode to talk about the temperature differences which have somewhat bamboozled the archaeologists.
There was abnormal thermodynamic properties to the water, as in it literally defied the laws of thermodynamics, so they needed to work out what was going on there, and that the entire site could have been literally activated by electricity, electromagnetic electricity. That's the reason for the mound on top of, and we know because of studies that water reacts differently and conducts differently with electricity running through it. So perhaps the entire site was designed to work in flow with the ether or electromagnetic energy, with the very particular aquifer, with this thermodynamic healing property water.
So accepting that this is actually healing water, there's another very interesting comment that she made with regards to the electrical aspect, which is actually going to be another brief episode that I will do on piezoelectric energy created by the Osireion. But these are all pieces of this wonderful jigsaw. And this time just looking at, is it Strabo's well? So who was Strabo? He was a Greek geographer. He was a philosopher and a historian. And I know that sounds like a lot, but in those days, if you were intellectual, you kind of had more than one string to your bow. And being a geographer, he did a fair bit of travelling, and he first visited Egypt in about 25 BC. He writes about some really interesting stuff, including the Hawira labyrinth. He went to Abydos, and he spoke about a well, which may or may not be the Osireion. Let's see if we can work that out from what he said about the Osireion. And one other thing before we look at what he had to say, he actually spent a lot of time in Alexandria, and he did his research there in the Library of Alexandria. He published the first edition of his book on travels in about 7 BC. So I'm now going to read to you what it said in his book. It has a fountain situated at a great depth. There is a descent to it through an arched passage built with single stones of remarkable size and workmanship. There is a canal which leads to this place from the great river. About the canal is a grove of Egyptian scanthus. I think it probably is the well of Strabo. Another weird aspect of the Osireion. Piezoelectric energy created by the megalithic cyclopean blocks of the Osireion. Let's start by addressing what piezoelectric energy is. So piezoelectric energy is created through the conversion of stress to electrical energy, and this occurs in certain materials that have a specific crystalline structure. When these piezoelectric materials are subjected to stress or vibration, etc., they generate an electrical charge. This is due to the movement of positive and negative charge centers within the material, which then creates an electric dipole and hence energy. This can produce energy, obviously, also frequency and possibly even ultrasonic. And the granite within the Osireion has the right qualities to do this. There is speculation that the Osireion has various mystical or paranormal healing properties, and that the energy that the structure produces may in fact have something to do with it. The amount of weight involved in these massive granite pillars and roofing blocks do create that stress. I can't tell you if any studies have actually been done on this particular form of energy, but I can tell you that this location feels different. It feels similar to the way it feels within the Great Pyramid. So I know that's not terribly scientific, but this place certainly is special.